things that, for an early stage company, that's all I really care about. The fourth one is more for slightly more mature companies, and I call that having a business model, having some concept of how you're going to make money. And for an early stage company, I'm willing to give the entrepreneurs the benefit of the doubt that we'll figure out the business model at some point. If it's a slightly more mature company, if they haven't been thinking real hard about the business model, to me that's a red flag. So having one of these industry icons, so that's 1.1 about partnering with big companies. Get some of that big company experience in. Then the more conventional topic, which I think is what Dave was thinking about more, is funding and partnering from big companies. And I just want to think about what are the different ways that you can get, first of all, funded by a big company, and we can think about what are some of the pluses and minuses of it. And then the other is partnering, and those are the things that we'll talk about. So first of all, how do you get funded by a big company? Well, one kind of easy and really safe way to do it is there are some venture capital firms that are primarily funded by companies. So you know about a lot about venture capital. Venture capital firms, just like you, they have to go out and raise money themselves. And they can get their money from financial investors, or they can get their money from strategic investors. That's typically venture capital jargon for a company. Cisco or Apple or whatever could provide some money to the venture capital firm. And there are some venture capital firms that get almost 100% of their money from strategic investors. And what they are is kind of the eyes and ears for some of the strategics. So there's Emerald, there's like 3 or 4 others that are fairly well known out there that are largely strategically funded. And you get your money from them, and it actually provides an interesting advantage because you sort of get an implicit connection to a number of strategics. And they probably have run the idea past the strategics before they've even invested in you, or they know what the strategics are looking for. So you're sort of getting a little bit of that industry perspective in a pretty safe way. And safe because there are some risks to taking money from companies. Second is a number of companies have their own venture capital firms called strategic venture capital firms. BASF has it, LG, GE, Chevron. And what ends up happening is that these strategic venture firms in corporations tend to go through sort of cycles. They become really hot within the company, and then they kind of die off, and they're very schizophrenic. Some companies get excited about doing them, and then they pull the plug on them, and then they start them up again, and they don't quite know what they're doing because it's sometimes unclear what the advantage is. The amount of money that Apple can make from Apple venture firm is probably pretty small, most likely compared to what Apple makes just from selling iPhones, right? So it doesn't particularly affect their bottom line, but it gives them a window into what's going on out there in the world. And sometimes they decide they need the window, sometimes they decide they don't. But there's a little bit of a risk there, because if you take money from one of those, some of their competitors, you're probably not going to be able to take money from some of their competitors. So if you take money from one of the big wind companies, the other wind companies, even if it's legally possible for you to take the money, they're probably not going to want to invest. So it looks like you've already sort of cast your lot with one of these other ones. There's direct corporate funding. So the corporate can fund you directly without having a venture capital arm. And there is also that risk that it looks like you've now tied yourself too tightly. You're an ammonia company and you take money from one of the major ammonia producers. Even if it's not true, that's going to send a message to the other ammonia producers that, you know, don't even bother to talk to these guys. And you might not want that to be the case so early on in the company's lifetime. Then there are corporate incubators. So again, a number of corporations have started incubators where they fund incubators, and again, that's could have some risk. I was just visiting a company in Korea just a couple weeks ago that has a huge space, and they want to start a corporate incubator where they just want to bring companies in. And it could be really exciting for an entrepreneur, but you might have already looked like you're too closely aligned. So that's one of the risks. And then there's partnerships. And forming some sort of partnership with a big company. And that's, you know, that's a lot more complicated story that we'll, I know we have like 15 minutes. So how much time do we have before, when does Andrew come?
Andrew's on at 3:30.
All right, so I'll talk for like 15 more minutes and we'll just have open-ended questions and discussion. So what are some of the other advantages to either getting funding from a big company or forming a partnership? And then we'll talk a little bit more about partnerships after we talk about some of the advantages and the disadvantages. So, I mean, one we've already sort of talked about is credibility. If you're an undergraduate student at Stanford and you decide to start a nuclear reactor company, there's going to be people that are going to go, come on, how much could they know about the ins and outs of a nuclear reactor? But if you've teamed up with an industry icon or one of the major nuclear reactor companies is funding you, so okay, this person must have a pretty cool, good idea. So you do get credibility. Again, you might get unique access to resources, both testing resources, pilot facilities, expensive equipment that you could never dream of building. So that might be another reason why you would want to form one of these relationships, is just to get access to the equipment and the testing. We've already talked about tapping into some of the knowledge that these companies have, tapping into some of their customers and some of their channels to market is something that could be very, very hard for you to develop in certain industries, say fertilizer or something, that would be helpful. And it could be a pretty straightforward exit opportunity, merger and acquisition opportunity or exit. Also, and this again I know is something that Dave is thinking about, is some of these startups require tremendous amount of capital to build pilot plants, but also to build the first plant. And sometimes the time scales are longer than what the typical venture capital is going to want to put up with. So maybe a strategic partner is going to be willing to take the longer time. What are the risks? Well, we've already talked about the risks, you know, being linked to somebody that's going to maybe cause other people in the field to avoid you. What if you link up with, it turns out to be the wrong partner? You know, you linked up with one and now you really wish you would link up with another one. Some of these groups are going to want to have certain degrees of control, and depending on how well you're doing in raising funding from financial venture capitalists, if you get all of your money from strategics, they may have a lot of control and there's going to be nobody to kind of buffer it out. The financial guys are typically able to help you buffer this out. You may have limited exit options because you maybe just have one exit option. There's corporate politics. Big companies are weird organizations with lots of complicated politics that it's hard to understand. They could make a decision like, just forget it, we're done, it's over. Totally write off their investment. Let's say they put 10 or 20 million dollars in you. To them, that's probably nothing. And they could pull the plug immediately, instantaneously, maybe without even giving you any heads up. So that is a risk, and I can give you some examples of that. In some rare cases, there's even examples of them basically stealing IP, and so doing the investment, getting the company, and then just basically running off with the IP. And that is really, really rare, by the way, because most big companies that I have worked with are terribly, terribly afraid of violating IP and respect IP very, very strongly. But, by the way, I'm actually in the midst of an example of a strategic investor basically ripping off a bunch of IP from a company in the middle of a lawsuit. So I do know that it happens, although it is extremely rare. So that's those are kind of the big topics. I'd like to make sure we have time for discussion, but I'll just maybe run through real quickly just a few of the names that jumped to mind on the good, bad, and the ugly. So I was on the board of a company called Cirrus Chemistry that has developed really the next generation of acrylic acid technology, coatings for automobiles. You can coat automobiles without heating. It's one of the biggest capital and energy driving aspects of the auto industry, and coatings that don't require the heating. Really cool. They were great at strategic partnerships with all the big players, you know, the BASFs of the world, and did a wonderful job. Two things that they did to make it work. They made sure that they restricted the scope of what those partnerships were, very carefully said you have rights for use in this industry for these applications, and they also worked to try to restrict the geography. So when they did a partnership, you have to give something. You're not going to do a partnership with a company, have them give you millions of dollars without giving away something, but be very strategic about what you give away. The other thing that they did is they found one of these industry icons. They found the person who was responsible for all M&A deals at Dow Chemical, who was just retiring. And they signed him up to be their deal negotiator guy. So here's a guy, for the last 20 years, has been on the other side of the table doing these deals. Hi, Andrew. And I hope you don't mind if I stick around to listen to your talk. I'd love to hear. Okay.
I'm late for class as usual.
Good. Anyway, so this was brilliant, because they're trying to make these complicated deals, and they have got the guy who has been doing this for 20 years sitting on their side of the table doing the deals. They did a wonderful job. They were recently bought by a Japanese company, and in record time, by the way. Rumor has it selling yourself to a Japanese company is very complicated. They were able to do it in less than 6 months. So, great example. Another good example, almost a bafflingly good example of industry partnerships is a company called Anelotech that's just been struggling and just surviving. But what they do is they take biomass and they convert it into aromatic chemicals like benzene, toluene, and these can then be used to make terephthalic acid, which is the basis of PET, Coke bottles. lots of interest in bio-based Coke bottles. They have taken zero venture capital. They have funded the entire company based on strategic funding from big corporations. The nice thing about that, and they've just made sure that the big corporations were not competing with one another. So one is a resin maker, one of them is a alcoholic beverage bottling company, one of them is, makes certain types of equipment. So they were able to piece together a group of non-competing strategics, not venture firms, but companies. So jury's still out whether they'll be successful or not, but the amazing thing is, when you take money from a financial venture capitalist or even a strategic venture capitalist, they're really, really, really concerned with the financial side of the deal, and they're going to get all sorts of special perks and benefits and liquidation rights, and the term sheet is going to be pretty well thought out. These company investors could care less about that stuff. This company, the founders still probably own 75 or 80% of the company, and they've brought in $100 million or more worth of financing and haven't had to give away almost anything. That is very, very unique. Monolith is the company that we're an investor in, and just as I'm talking about the good, what did Monolith do that is good? Monolith really focused on bringing in the industry expertise early on. They knew that we're going to try to make carbon black. Carbon black is a mind-bogglingly complex area. When I was a chemical engineering professor, I remember, this is probably the response most people have when they hear about carbon black. I remember I had an undergraduate student from India who was one of my advisees. And I remember him coming into my office and he said, yeah, my dad owns like the biggest carbon black company in India. And I remember my eyes glazing over of thinking, this is the most boring thing I've ever heard in my life. I was a biotech professor. I am so pissed off at myself because